Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Appreciate it. Thank you. I hope you feel the same when it's over. Just nice to be welcomed and into this beautiful auditorium on such an enormous theme. And I'm just fascinated by how the technology puts together everything so quickly, so we immediately know what everybody is thinking and almost hearing people change their minds. Now that's as incredible as it gets. The evening will be as follows. I will present my talk for about 45 minutes. Interestingly enough, let me give you at least a one-line description because it'll add to the theme of today. My ancestors came from the highest caste of the Hindu priesthood in the Deep South. I myself became a follower of Jesus in my teens. I mention all of that to say because at the end of my talk, I'll be joined for a Q&A session by Dr. Nabil Qureshi, whose parents actually hail from Pakistan. And he was formerly a Muslim and now a follower of Christ himself. And I find it incredible when I think of this because I was born and raised in India. And if there's any point of tension in India today, it is the whole issue of the Indo-Pak conflict. All that goes on and rages. I've just returned from India a few days ago. And here we are, two of us, talking on the issue of tolerance in an American university campus. Two brown faces coming up onto the platform to speak to an audience like this. Only in America could we have such a privilege accorded, and hopefully what follows from a discussion can also be of great meaning. It reminds me of the gentleman who walked into a room, and he was from Japan, walked into this dining room, and there was a table at the front, and he sat down, and the Englishman looking at him thought maybe he would help him a bit. So when the Japanese gentleman sat down and was opening a book of his, the English gentleman looked at him and picked up the spoon and said, "This be spoony." And then he took the knife and said, "And this be knifey, and this be forky, and this be platey." And the Japanese gentleman kept nodding. At the end of the lunch, to the shock of the Englishman, the Japanese gentleman was the keynote speaker. And he delivered the talk in flawless English, sat down and looked at the Englishman and said, "You like his speechy?" I feel a little bit like that today, although I'm not sure you like either speechy. But it's just wonderful to have a privilege of being in such a distinguished institution. Thank you to all of the groups that have made it possible for me to be here, for your kindness, your warm invitation. And when Nabil joins me, you'll truly be inspired to hear from a man like him, a medical doctor by training, but picked up other degrees along the way. He is part of my team now. And I think on a theme of tolerance, I thought it would be just exciting to have some of his perspectives as well. I was raised in India in a minority, both living in the north, coming from the south, and by virtue of my faith. India is, of course, 80% Hindu, 10% Muslim. The Christian population at that time was less than 2%, more like 4% now. So growing up in those settings, you get accustomed to believing in a counter perspective, or learning to live in a pluralistic society is a constant challenge. I returned from India last week, and amazingly, to find audiences packed in every case, whether it is a business community or the acting world of Bollywood, or whether it was the medical school in the south in Vellore, every setting to have a packed audience, asking questions about faith, about purpose, about meaning, and what it really means to be human. Once upon a time, I'd be standing in front of Indian audiences like that, terrified, because I knew my worldview would be quite dramatically different to that of the audience in front of me. And now when you stand up and speak of those, notably a few times I've done it with the Bollywood world, how they will lean forward, listen, interact, ask some of the brightest questions. And it is a marvelous example of what it is to be able to discuss issues of such incredible importance, some of which could actually go deep into the consciences, laying claim to that conscience, but to do it in a civil way without rancor, without hate, and without that sense of bitterness that oftentimes disagreements can spawn. So I hope whatever happens tonight, that one thing that we can see accomplished is at the end of it, around your tables or your homes or in your classroom, that these issues can be discussed without that hostility. Because let's ask ourselves one fundamental question. What is the ultimate goal in a civilized society? Is it really that we will all agree with each other? I doubt it. That is really to pursue the impossible. But what is possible is that even in the midst of our disagreement, we will learn to live in a civil way, as deep as those differences might be. I have learned to live that way. I've learned to be in audiences like that. Many times I'm in Islamic universities. I know how tense those audiences will be. I remember a few years ago being in the oldest Islamic University of Malaysia in Kuala Lumpur, and in front of that audience with mullahs and scholars sitting in the front row, having to speak for 1 hour in the defense of my faith. And I tell you the truth, at the end of it, when I walked in, the professor of world religions there was Professor Baharuddin, specializing in Islamics, and her actual words to me were, if it were not improper, I would lean over and give you an embrace and give you a hug for the way the subject matter was handled today. And I said, Professor Baharuddin, that's the best compliment you can give to me. So whether it's in a Buddhist framework or a Hindu framework or an Islamic framework or a secular framework, this is my calling. And if there is any way in which I have offended you without warrant or without meaning to come across in the way I did, please do not hesitate to let me know, because that is not my intent. My intent is to get us thinking seriously and in a sober-minded way, because America is at the crossroads. The North America into which I came in my 20s is very different to the North America of today. And one has to be incredibly cautious, as one word can create such turmoil and go viral within minutes and create havoc for everybody. That does not really benefit the subject matter at all. So please, as we present it, we want to do it with sensitivity, and if there are points of deep tension, what I would want more than anything else is for you to let us know, so that we know at least that we are standing on a clear ground of communication. In the 1980s, there was an article written in Atlantic Monthly in which America was being discussed as a country on a dramatically different course to how far it had come in prior years. So 1980s was the year the sociologists were beginning to really delineate all the changes that were taking place. And the article written by Daniel Yankelevich began with a definition of culture, and this is how he worded it. Culture is an effort to provide a coherent set of answers to the existential situations that confront all human beings in the passage of their lives. So when you take that statement alone, you see that it is setting before us the course of coherence as the goal to answer the existential questions, meaning the felt questions of the heart and the mind as they are bridged, to find a coherent set of answers to the existential questions that confront all of us in the passage of our lives. That is the goal of what culture is intended to be, as Yankel bomb blast school. It is but the sound of man worshiping his maker. Where do we get off with this? Where do we exit when we make secularization with an uppercase S to evict all religious thought and all religious belief in the public square, which is really what often happens? Where do we get off? I'll tell you what happens. The definitions to which we cling will become extremely elusive till we do not know where to draw the lines of difference anymore. I give the illustration in the 1980s of Larry Flint being brought to trial in Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta's been my home. If I did that in Toronto today, I'll never get anywhere. Completely changed, completely changed. Pluralization as does seem to emerge, doesn't it? And the professor of psychology said, I think we can go now. I said, I want to tell you something, sir. Even in India, we look both ways before we cross the street. It is either the bus or me, not both of us. I said, you don't understand either Shankara or Gautama Buddha. If Gautama Buddha believed in the both hand, explain to me why it was he was born a Hindu and walked away from Hinduism and started his own pursuit of enlightenment. Why couldn't he take both hands? Why did Shankara write his dissertation and his thesis on the exclusivity of the Vedic literature and so on? You see, ladies and gentlemen, truth has a jagged edge. It ultimately will stab you if you try to walk against it. Winston Churchill said the most valuable thing in the world is the truth. It is so valuable that often it is hidden by a bodyguard of lies. Dan Sharansky, the former justice minister in the Soviet Union, went back from Israel to the former place where he had been imprisoned in solitary confinement. He took his wife, and as he went back to the prison, his wife was about to go with him. He said, could you stand out for a moment, please? I want to go in alone. He said, because I sat there for day after day after day, dark in that dungeon where I really found myself. And Sharansky went there and wept, thinking of how they nearly destroyed him. But as he came out, he asked if he could go to the grave of Andrei Sakharov, the physicist who gave Russia the atomic bomb. And the media followed him, and he went and laid a wreath at Sakharov's grave. And he came back and said, the reason I have done this is because of what Sakharov said to me. He said, I always thought the most powerful weapon in the world was the bomb. I have changed my mind. The most powerful weapon in the world is the truth. Does America want the truth? With pluralization, which is a good thing, are we going to exit with an absolutizing of relativism? Think about it. And finally, privatization, where what you believe in the most sacred, you're forced to keep to the private and never bring it into the public. That's where America is headed. And with great sadness, I say to you, this is the deadliest of all mistakes we are making. Because that which is sacred to you in private is also sacred to you in public. It ought to be a serious thing. I have learned to live with disagreement. I've learned to give people all the floor time they want in dialoguing and defending and debating. But I've walked away embracing that person and saying, truth will win out in the end. We have the right to disagree, but we don't have the right to be disagreeable. I'll tell you what I've noticed in 41 years of travel, and I'll close with an illustration or two here. It is this. The cancer of our time can be described in one word: meaninglessness. Meaninglessness. You talk to an average young person today, how many sexual trysts do they really want to find fulfillment? How much money in the bank do they really want to find fulfillment? The loneliest people in the world I have found have been the most indulgent ones who've come away totally empty. As Chesterton said, meaninglessness does not come from being weary of pain. Meaninglessness comes from being weary of pleasure. Meaninglessness does not come from being weary of pain. Meaninglessness comes from being weary of pleasure. Skeptics often tell me that it's the problem of pain that keeps them from believing in God. May I suggest to you, it's the problem of pleasure that keeps me from being totally secular. Been there, done that, tried this. It simply doesn't work. I recall when I was doing a Bible study with the Atlanta Braves when they were playing the St. Louis Cardinals, sort of 10, 12 minutes each of the chapels. And I walked in there, and I closed with this. I said to them, you know, fellas, there's nothing like walking into a room and being the only one who fails the physical. I said, I looked at you boys, muscles bulging like watermelons, and I walk in here. I'll never forget the line of my wife once when I gave her a nice, good hug. She smiled, hugged me back, and said, you know what? You have the arms of a thinking man. I burst out laughing. And she said, I didn't mean it. I didn't mean that in a bad way. I didn't mean that. Oh, what a compliment. What a compliment. I said, I'll do my best to make these the arms of a non-thinking man. So I said, guys, I can't talk to you about baseball. You guys hit a ball long before I know it's even come. So no, I'm not going to talk to you about that. I said, here's what I want to talk to you about. How to live your life on the road, because I've probably lived that longer than any one of you sitting in front of me. They leaned forward and started to listen. One of the most notable players from one of the teams, multi-million-dollar contract, walks up towards me and he puts his hand on the back of my neck like this, and then puts his head on my shoulder and starts to sob. And my travel assistant, knowing it was a very precious moment for him, just walked away into the distance, and he looked at me and he said, Ravi, I have more money than I ever thought I'd have, but I want to tell you I've lost everything of real value in my life. I wished I'd applied the principles you gave us today long before. Are we on the highway to abandonment with pleasure without principle, pleasure without boundaries? Think about it. Think about it. You can't have everything. You can't. Meaninglessness is the plague of an average university student around the globe today. I could find better ways to make a living than what I'm doing. But this is a calling. This is a conviction. And I will tell you, I have seen lives transformed who've taken that path and turned away from complete hedonistic paths to a life that builds its moral boundaries with the revelation of God himself. Secularization is a good entry point. No, we do not want a theocratic culture. We do not want a state religion. That would be even worse. But secularization that does not allow religious discourse in the public square on the academy is going to end up with a generation devoid of shame. Pluralization, if it doesn't understand the laws of logic and moral boundaries, will end up ultimately living in systemic and systematic contradiction. It'll weigh down, it'll implode under the weight of its own loose living. And finally, privatization, where you sever the public from the private and you force a person to believe all the sacred things in private and never begin into the public square, you end up with a totally desacralized society. In the words of Albert Camus, the loneliest moment is when you have just experienced that which you thought will deliver the ultimate, and it has let you down. And so I say to you, ladies and gentlemen, if we are going to be civil in the square, if we are going to be respectful of each other's, we have three choices as an application. We can have a theonomous culture, a heteronymous culture, or an autonomous culture. A theonomous culture where we may believe that God's law is so ingrained in our hearts that we all think the same way. There is no culture around like that. India is the closest thing to it, but most cultures will not accept that because it'll come close to making a state religion. We don't want a theonomous culture. We haven't had it in history to see it once we did away with natural law. Heteronymous culture is that which a handful from above dictate to the masses below. Islamic states are heteronymous cultures. Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia are heteronymous cultures. They enforce the belief from the few over the masses. In Marxism, in China, in Russia, they are heteronymous cultures dictating to the masses what they must believe. Theonomous, we don't see it visible. Heteronymous is not where America needs to go. So you've got an autonomous culture, autos meaning self, nomos meaning law, where we pride in our individuality. If that is true, then we must be respectful of each person's belief, and I must be respected for my belief too, in the Word of God, in my commitment to Christ, and let the truth ultimately win out. If we are truly going to be autonomous, let's follow it through. Let's not tell people we have an autonomous culture, and as soon as they say they believe in God, switch to an heteronymous technique and enforce them not to believe in the liberty of their own conscience, but compel them to believe in something else. Theonomous, heteronymous, autonomous. And I believe the last is our option here. And in the marketplace, in the debating square, truth will win out. And if that happens, America has hope for the future. That is my talk for you tonight. God bless you. Thank you. This is Nabil Qureshi, by the way. I think you'll really enjoy listening to his, those of you who were at the talk last night. As I told you, he's a medical doctor by training, but then did his master's work in biblical studies at Duke, and took another one at another master's degree at Biola, and he is about to enter into his doctoral program of studies as a medical doctor now, but going into doctoral work in his philosophical pursuits. He will also be sharing the Q&A. I think it is very important to engage in dialogue. Dogmatic claims can be stated as something that is truly believed in your conviction, but it must be justified, not just asserted. Why do I lay claim to what I do with such deep conviction? For example, if somebody asks me, why do I support the Christian worldview? My answer is very simple to them, because there are 4 questions of life: the question of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. And when I test out each one of those in their truth component, I can find answers, biblical answers on origin, meaning, morality, and destiny that conform to reality as I can test it out. And when the 4 answers are given together, they provide a coherent worldview. So is that a dogmatic belief? Yes, it is believed in the sense of a conviction, but it is defended with grace, undergirded by kindness, and not in a bullish or a mean-spirited way. If truth is not undergirded by love, it makes the possessor of that truth obnoxious, and the dogma he possesses becomes repulsive. So you must hold on to it with compassion and kindness and courtesy, but it must also be defended at the same time. So carry on a dialogue. Don't be afraid of laying claim to truth, so long as you have ably defended it, and the counter perspective has a challenge to question what you believe, and at that point you have to unpack it and give a response. That's how dialogue actually goes. It's the interaction of logic. It's two different views coming together, and the dialogical method is the best way. Let me give you, can I take a minute on this and give you a classic example of this? Because I think this is fascinating to understand. When I spoke at the Islamic University in Malaysia, prior to my coming there, the great Islamic apologist Ahmed Deedat had come and really attacked the Christian worldview wholesale. Any one of you who's ever read anything by Deedat or ever heard him, he's passed away now. He lived in Durban, South Africa. Vitriolic, hostile in the way he debated. And he truly offended the Christians in the audience, albeit they were a minority. A professor of geology there, Professor Lee, put his hand up. And he said, I have a question for you. Why do you attack what I believe and call it inconsistent and unlivable? So Deedat says, come up here to the front. Come up here right now. So Professor Lee, who's a professor of geology at the Islamic University in Malaysia, walks up to the front. Professor Lee himself told me this story. He said, I walk up to the front, and Deedat looked at me, and he said, come up closer and stare me in the eye. And Lee did. He took his right hand and gave him one heavy-handed slap on the face. And this is a gently built man, Professor Lee. He said, my face was burning and my whole body was quivering. And he said, as I gathered my composure, he said, turn the other cheek now. Turn the other cheek. That's your faith. Lee said, I didn't know I could handle it. I said, God, give me strength. And I turned the other side of the face, and there was some hisses coming from the audience. So he said, all right, I'll solve this in a hurry. Give me your shirt. So Lee unbuttons his shirt. He says, you're supposed to give me your trousers too. So he turned to the audience. He said, my students, please forgive me for doing this. But my faith in Christ is real, and I want to show this man it is real. It's not fake. He unbelted his trousers, standing there with his face in pain, in his underwear, turns around and walks back into his office. Professor Lee told me there was a lineup outside my door, knocking, 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 my own Islamic students wanting to have just 1 minute with me, some of them coming on bended knee asking me for forgiveness for what had just been done to him. You can present dogmatic truth with love and gentleness without being obnoxious. Sometimes it'll be in kind, sometimes it'll be in word. It must always be with a gracious spirit, because the truth unbeautified becomes unattractive, and it can be defended well. Okay, thank you.
The next question is, how can we in the university of today effectively impact our culture of subjective tolerance?
Do you want to take that?
Yes. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I really resonate with this question. I feel like I'm a perpetual student. At least that's what my wife tells me. I've finished studying at, as was just said, at Duke and Biola, and I had my medical degree as well, so a long time in the university. And one thing that I found out is that as you study in the university, when people hear what you have to say, they often don't really listen to it. They don't really care what you have to say because everyone has an opinion. Opinions are cheap nowadays. Opinions come, as many as there are people, you'll hear opinions. What they really want to hear is how much you care. And they don't want to just hear that, they want to see that. And once you embody what you actually believe, then your beliefs start to come out more openly, more visibly. When I was in medical school, one of the things that I absolutely believed at the time, and I still believe today, is that life is valuable. Life is valuable at all phases. And one way that I expressed it was in an exam room, in a surgery exam room. A woman had come in, and she had come in for a completely unrelated case. And they were about to do an examination on her. They were about to do something which required her to not be pregnant. Now, she did not know she was pregnant. She had no idea she was pregnant. I asked her if she took any kind of precautions on a regular basis, and she said no, she didn't, because her boyfriend had told her that that he was sterile. So this was the understanding with which she came into this situation. Now, when I asked her to just double check, when the surgeon comes in to ask you if you want to do this procedure, make sure you double check with him. You actually do this test to see if you're pregnant. And she asked me why, what would happen. And it was at that moment that I was able to explain to her that there could very well be a life inside her. And that life inside her would be affected forever based on the decisions she made at this moment. And it is in that kind of situation when I'm reaching out to her and telling her how valuable life is that I'm then able to tell her what my beliefs are. And in that circumstance, when there's real life in the balance, when there's real emotion and real power in that moment, then when you share with someone your beliefs, they matter. Whereas if you stand on a street corner and pontificate without people knowing that you care, it's not going to work. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand street preachers. I understand the impetus of standing on a street corner and yelling to people who are walking towards death and destruction. What you want to say to them, the message you have to them, you just want to get it out there. But unless they know that you care, it's not going to matter. It's not going to work. So whenever I engage in any kind of conversation with someone, I want to know what their struggles are personally. I want to know what they're going through personally. I ask them what's going on in their life, and I connect with them at a personal level. And once you do that, in the university setting, then they will see that what your beliefs are actually do matter. Thanks.
Okay, our next question. How do we profitably discuss hyper-politicized topics such as abortion, marriage, and sexual norms?
Abortion, marriage, and sexual norms. How do we profitably discuss it?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's interesting how much culture plays into this. In some parts of the world, these are things that will never even be discussed publicly because it will be offensive in certain audiences to even pontificate on those issues. Here, fortunately, in the sense that we have an open culture in which we can talk about these things. My own view is this to the questioner. Thank you for asking this. because I think these are the issues that are bringing so much hurt within our culture, so much pain to people, so much rancor, so much offense. And so here's what I say oftentimes when I'm speaking in audiences. I say, look, we will differ in applicational matters. We will differ in matters of inference. We will differ in matters of choices all along the way. But it'll always boil down to one question to each of us. What is your starting point? That's what I am interested in. That's the key. Because, some years ago I was asked to do a lecture at Johns Hopkins on the subject, what does it mean to be human? Francis Collins and I were representing the Judeo-Christian side of it, and all other scholars from different vantage points. And when I began to prepare for my talk, it dawned on me how critical that question really is. On the basis of how you've answered the question, what does it mean to be human? All of your other extensions and applications are made. Your application in sexuality, your application in pleasure, your application in truth-telling, in relationships. All of these emerge from the bottom line definition of what you believe it means to be human. For example, if you were to take an automobile and use it to run over another human being, you can't blame the maker of the automobile for killing that other human being. The automobile maker will say, that's not the purpose of why I made this car. If you cannot take an instrument and use it for a purpose for which it was not made, and therefore try to think you can blame the maker of that instrument, how can we really define sexuality, marriage, values, if we don't know the purpose of our lives? That, to me, is where we need to be discussing these very carefully. Is life sacred? Is life at its core of intrinsic worth and not extrinsic worth conveyed by state? Let me give you a vivid example of this. When I finished a series of talks at Oxford, we were talking on the nature of absolutes. And one young Oxonian came up to the front, and he was pretty articulate in what he said. He said to me, of all the things you've said today, the one thing I really take issue with is the absolute. He said, I don't agree with you that there needs to be an absolute. I said, if you don't talk about an absolute, you're talking about a one-ended stick. I don't even understand. Everything is relative. And we went on this road. He said, I don't believe there are absolutes. I said, all right, let me ask you this question. And there were students standing around him, his classmates. I said, I take a one-year-old baby in your presence, and I put that baby on this platform where I'm standing, and take a jagged-edged butcher knife and chop this baby up for my pleasure. Would you believe I have done something bad or something evil? I kid you not. He paused. He went like this with his toe, and then he looked at me and said, Mr. Zacharias, I wouldn't like what you did, but I cannot honestly tell you you have done something evil. And all of his classmates standing around him went, whoa. You see, when you start from the premise that everything is of pragmatic value and nothing of essential value, you veer off into the distance with nothing remaining sacred anymore. What is it in the Ten Commandments that really are summarized in one word? Your body is sacred, your life is sacred, your possessions are sacred, your marriage is sacred, your word is sacred, your time is sacred, and so is your neighbor's. You don't violate that. So if you ask me how we talk on these things, I think it is the wrong starting point. We have to start with the foundation. And a best illustration is in the University of Ohio, when I was being driven there to my lecture, you go past the Wexner Center of the Arts. And the man driving me said, that's America's first postmodern building. I said, what's a postmodern building? He said, it has no purpose. There are really no designs. There are stairways that go nowhere. There are rooms that are of odd shape. He said, and the architect said, if life itself has no purpose, why should our buildings have any purpose? He said, what do you think? I said, I have one question for that architect. Did he do that with the foundation as well? City Hall would never give you the permission to build a foundation with no purpose. The foundation has to have a purpose. So in all of these discussions, you have to start from the foundation. What does it mean to be human? Is life sacred or desacralized? On those two edifices, you build the rest of the infrastructure. Otherwise, you've got your feet firmly planted in midair, and you can't stand on that. Okay.
Okay, these are two related questions from different students. How do you explain the tragedies caused by the proliferation of Christian beliefs, like the Crusades? And was manifest destiny and the subsequent extermination of Native Americans done graciously?
I'll take part of that. The first part of the question was, how do we explain the tragedies caused by Christians?
Yes, by the proliferation of Christian beliefs.
By the proliferation of Christian beliefs. Well, part of what my story is that I was raised Muslim. I was raised very, very devout Muslim growing up. My family taught me to believe in everything that Islam taught. My mother is actually the daughter of a Muslim missionary. She was born in Indonesia, though she was from Pakistan, because her father spent his whole life preaching Islam in Indonesia. That's how devout our Islamic heritage and upbringing was. And so part of growing up for me was to really embody and embrace Islam. And so when I met Christianity, I had been taught not just to embody and embrace Islam, but to respond against Christianity. That was part of my identity. Being from a foreign upbringing in the West, we wanted to galvanize ourselves against foreign influence. My parents had seen what America was like. They had heard things before coming here, and they had these presuppositions when they came here that America is a promiscuous nation. They see things on television, they see adultery on television, they see people carousing, and then they think America is a Christian nation. This is what's on American TV, therefore this must be Christianity. And so when they were raising up me and my sister, they wanted to make sure we were defended against Christianity. And so that was part of what I was coming up, was just naturally antagonistic towards the doctrines and beliefs of Christianity. Now, one thing that I noticed when I was being introduced to the theology of Christianity that struck me tremendously as a Muslim was just how powerful this idea is that God himself was willing to lower himself, to become a human, to suffer at the hands of men, and then die for their sake. Now, I just stopped and I thought about this for a second. This is the gospel message. This is the center. This is the crux of the Christian claims. That God, who deserves everything, who deserves to be worshipped by all creation, that God doesn't lord it over people. He's not a tyrant that demands that we jump through hoops so that he can be happy with us when we die, and hopefully he'll let us into heaven. You know, in Islam, the soteriology, we had, in order that we called it gunnah and sawab. There's an idea of blessings and of sin, and you have to outweigh your sin with your blessings in order to get into heaven. At the end of the day, you have to have more good deeds than bad in order to get into heaven. And so for me growing up, the idea was simple. If I sinned, I needed to do more good in order to outdo that. I shouldn't sin, but, you know, if I run a stop sign, stop at the next one twice, you know? Just kind of counteract your sin and you'll be okay at the end of the day. That's how I was raised. But constantly what I was thinking was, did I pray my prayers? Did I do the fast right? Did I accidentally swallow some water when I was in the shower? When you're fasting, you're not allowed to drink any water at all. Did I accidentally swallow some water when I'm in the shower? Because if I did, that's a sin. I broke my fast. And I'm worried constantly all the time. Have I committed some tragic mistake? When I was introduced to this idea of Christianity, it was mind-blowing, because here's what it is. God knows that you're going to sin against him. God knows that you have sinned against him. I don't need to convince anyone that they've sinned. All I have to do is ask someone, do you believe that you have lived up to your standards? To your own standards. Forget anyone else's standards. Have you lived up to your own standards? And everyone I've asked that question to has said, no. And here's the beauty of the Christian message, that God loves you anyway. And he doesn't just love you in a sense of, oh, I'll let you be and I accept you for who you are. God loves you so much that he's willing to die for you. That is the message of Christianity. What did Christ do? He gives this message of the Good Samaritan. This is in the book of Luke. He talks about a Jew and a Samaritan. These were two polar opposites in their culture insofar as one did not have meals with the other, one did not care for the other, and yet Jesus, a Jew himself, upheld in this story the ideals of a Samaritan who's willing to sacrifice himself for the sake of his enemy. And not just did Jesus share that story, he then lived it out. For as Christian theology tells us, he was willing to die for our sakes, even when we were his enemies. Understand this for just one moment. The Christian theology is teaching us that God, who created the heavens and the earth, who is due all glory and all fame and all honor, was willing to be born as a child to two children themselves, and then to be bearing the ignominy of being an illegitimate child. Why? Why? And as he grows up as an illegitimate child, what is he doing? He's working with his hands as a carpenter, the lowest of low, a tekton. Why? Why does he choose this? What was his lineage? His lineage was one that had prostitutes in it. His lineage was one that had idolaters in it. Why? As he goes and as he suffers at the hands of those who are flogging him, the people that he had poured his life into for 3 years all fled. They all betrayed him. What is Jesus teaching? He didn't have to do any of this, by the way. According to Christian theology, he didn't have to do any of this. He could have come as a prince. He could have come as a king. He could have come and lorded himself over people, but he did not. Why? Jesus is showing that he empathizes with our lowness, with our meekness, with our traits that people would look at us and spit upon us for. Jesus empathizes with that. And he willingly takes it upon himself. And then he suffers for the sake of his enemies. That is the Christian message. Jesus tells us as he's dying on the cross, killed by those he's dying for, he says to us, through what he's already taught us, he says, as I do for you, as I have loved you, go and love one another. That is the true Christian message. And I don't care what anyone comes with. Other than that message, it's not the message of Jesus. There is no suffering that can be justified by that message of Jesus. There's no tragedy, no crime, no genocide that can be justified with a message that says, die for your enemies. Be willing to die for them. This is the most peaceful message there is. This is the most self-sacrificial message there is. That's the message of the gospel. So when people hijack the name Christianity and commit atrocities in that name, don't confuse the name with the gospel message itself. And what we're standing here for today is the gospel message. We're not here to excuse the actions of those who committed tragedies. Yes, there are Christians throughout history who've done horrible things. And if I'm the first one to apologize for that, please, sincerely, I apologize that this was done in the name of my God. But that is not the message of my God. We are to lay down ourselves for the sake of anyone who disagrees with us. And when it comes to tolerance, that is, I think, the most ultimate embodiment of tolerance. Not only do you hear what your enemy has to say or what someone who disagrees with you has to say, not only do you hear that and nod and smile, you actually come alongside them. And after your disagreement, you sacrifice yourself for their sake. That is the most tolerant message that there could possibly be. And that is true Christianity.
Was there another part to the question?
There wasn't. I don't remember.
Was there a significant other part, or do we move on to the next one? Yeah.
Would you like me to repeat the question?
Sure.
All
yeah.
right. How do you explain the tragedies caused by the proliferation of Christian beliefs like the Crusades? And was manifest destiny and the subsequent extermination of Native Americans done graciously?
Okay, I think when you move to the particular from the general, the question is implicitly answered out there. Let me just, because it's been so beautifully presented in what the gospel is, let me just present two counterpoints here from the philosophical side of it. The first point is this. Whenever a question like this is raised, notice what is implicit in the question. Two things are implicit in the question. Number one, that human life has value. Human life has worth. How does naturalism give you that worth? Where does it come from? You cannot give intrinsic worth naturalistically. There has to be that transcendent value implicit in the human life. So the question actually posits an assumption that naturalism cannot really give to itself. Let me give you a little illustration of this. When I'm writing a book right now with my colleague from Oxford on why suffering, why pain. And I was watching a BBC production. It's a beautiful, beautiful production on polar bears. And I was just watching it so beautifully unfold, and the polar bear comes out of hibernation and has to feed its cubs. It gets onto the ice, but the ice is not as thick. It's taking longer to get to its prey. Comes to a pack of walruses, sets its eyes on the weakest of them, the baby one, and is about to pounce on it, but the other walruses come up to defend. A fight ensues. The polar bear doesn't win it out, and the walruses protect their little one. The polar bear turns around and walks away. And the last scene is the polar bear digging a grave for itself. It's not going to make it. And the BBC commentator, who had done a brilliant job so far, now goes into this. Why did it take so long for the polar bear to get to its prey? Because of global warming. And so we go on this big talk. Let's assume everything he said is right. What is he implying? He didn't for a moment question why this polar bear was being mean and looking at a tiny little walrus, when if its own little cubs were attacked, boy, it would draw blood. But that's not a moral question. It's truly in that predatorial animalistic setting. That's the misery of each is supposed to make up the good of all, and so you see it happen. Why did he lay moral responsibility to only one entity? That was a human being. We cannot seem to escape the fact that we are not mere animals. We have something that transcends animal instinct. We have a moral consciousness. So the assumptions of a question like this, A, give implicit worth to humanity. Secondly, that we have moral responsibility, neither of which can come from a naturalistic framework. So it has to come from a transcendent framework. Number two, never ever judge a philosophy by its abuse. Never ever judge a philosophy by its abuse. Take the integral claims of the philosophy, measure it against its claims, then critique it. If you abuse that philosophy and that critique, then you ultimately end up really judging something that it is not purporting to be. That's why Winston Churchill said democracy is the worst form of government except for all other forms of government. And what he was trying to tell us is freedom is a privilege, but if freedom is abused, then you end up destroying the structure completely. So A, it assumes essential worth. B, it assumes moral responsibility, neither of which come from naturalism. C, you do not judge a philosophy by its abuse. That's why state religions have committed so much of heinous acts, because politics got wedded to theology, and the same depraved condition moved into a palace and used its power to dictate its will upon others. The true belief of the Christian comes from the freedom of the will and the freedom of choice. Jesus never forced his belief on anyone. We live in a day where we can learn from those atrocious and terrible mistakes. And you know what? Those of us who see the abuse of groups of people like that, we should do everything in our power to take the message of Jesus and the love of Jesus to bring healing and restoration, because it is the Lord that has created them and created all of us, and we see each other with intrinsic worth. What we could probably do is take one more question, and then I'll make a closing statement. Yeah.
And for our last question, how do you explain the difference between the need for shame and intolerance? Isn't a system of shame inherently intolerant?
Did you get that? How do you explain?
How do you explain the need for...
The need for shame and intolerance. Isn't it a system of shame inherently intolerant?
Oh, I think this is based on your talk. You talked about shame.
Yeah, so is that is the idea, I'm not hearing it clear, is the idea of shame intolerant?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what?
Isn't it a system of shame inherently intolerant?
That's a great question, by the way. Really a good question. And the reason I say it is because I was born in a culture where shame is really used as a constant motivator to perform more. When I was not doing well in my school and was interested more in becoming a cricketer than getting any intellectual prowess of that sort, my dad would just lambaste me, or I'd get the worst kinds of thrashings. And the line he used on me one day, which ultimately broke my spirit, when he said, "You are going to bring shame to this family." And I think what we often do is use shame in order to hurt people. And that's really not what I'm talking about when I talk about the sense of shame as a warning. C.S. Lewis in his book, The Great Divorce, talks about it. He said, shame is like a hot drink. You can steadily drink it right down to the dregs, but you do anything else with it and it'll scald you. Shame is a personal corrector within your heart and mind where something wrong has been done, not for society to hurl its insults on you. They are two completely different things. But look at it this way. Psychiatrists are talking about a morning after drug for people with post-traumatic stress disorder. I know we've got veterans here and those who've been on the front lines. When I was in my mid-20s, I went to Vietnam. I was not prepared to see what I saw. I was a youngster. I was a student of theology. I was working with the chaplains. Many, many times after that, for weeks, I would be thinking back of the sights I saw on the side of the road. It traumatized me. The first night I came to Singapore, the free country, after speaking in Vietnam for 4 months, going all the way to the demilitarized zone and seeing all that was going on. I was a single young man. I'll never forget walking for 1 or 2 hours that night, just wishing almost I could slip that head and just let the memories of it out, because I didn't want to go back with that. And those of you who fought and the front lines and so on, I just met a young man here who was in Afghanistan and so on. We need to pray for them because the memories of these things take their toll. Here's the point. So doctors are dealing with this, how to deal with this medicationally. One of the fears of finding a medication to help those with legitimate stress and the disorder that comes. What if a rapist or a murderer does the same thing, rapes and murders, and goes and buys a pill and pops it the morning after with no remorse or no sense of feeling of wrong or shame whatsoever? What then happens to our society? So the same thing that benefits in a legitimate, stressful situation can be used in an illegitimate situation by people perpetrating wrong and doing violence for violence's sake. What I therefore boil it down to is this. In my heart and in your heart, where lines have been crossed that are wrong, I believe it's God's way of reminding you and me that what happened there was not right. And the more you work that away and make that which was illegitimate legitimized, you move more and more towards becoming a monster without any remorse of any kind. So I'm really not talking about a cultural imposition upon a person. I'm talking about the personal realization that wrong has been done. When culture imposes it wrongly, it is also a shameful thing to do. We don't work that methodology if we want the long-term results of good, which is for goodness sake. One more comment in my closing statement here. Oscar Wilde, I wrote a series of books on imaginary conversations, and one of them is the one that I really struggled with most and yet at the same time delved into quite a bit, where I did one on Jesus talks to Hitler, the Lamb and the Führer, Jesus talks to Buddha, the lotus and the cross, Jesus talks to Krishna, new birth or rebirth, and the one on Oscar Wilde is called Sense and Sensuality, Jesus talks to Oscar Wilde. It is interesting, this quintessential hedonist who may have autobiographically written The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is a brilliantly written book. He is lying on his deathbed in Paris. I visited the place and visited the church where his funeral was held. And ironically, it's the same church where Pascal's funeral was held. That's why in my book I have Pascal Wilde and Jesus in conversation. But here it is. He is lying on his bed and he looks at his lover Robbie Ross and he asks him this question. Did you ever love any one of those boys for their own sake? When I was reading that, I said, wow. Why does a hedonist all of a sudden look for an expression of a definition of love, where you're loving somebody for their own sake? He says, Robbie, did you love any one of these boys for their own sake? Robbie says, no. He says, neither did I. Neither did I. Bring me a priest, he said. And if you have never read his poem, The Ballad of Reading Gaol, it's one of the most powerful pieces of poetry, where he talks about the woman with the alabaster ointment who brought it and poured it at the feet of her Lord. And he said, so am I, like that, desperately in need of cleansing, for only blood can cleanse my blood, is what he said. And he went on to talk about only the sacrifice of Christ was now big enough to cleanse him and help him get rid of that tormented soul with which he was living. And so I say to you, as you see the nature of shame and guilt, it is interesting how at the closing moments of life, you want to find the right definitions for what you did. Did I love that boy for his own sake? No. Bring me a priest. Only Christ is big enough now. I want to tell you, and I'm really not being funny, if I'd come here in my teens and 20s, I would never have gotten into an institution like this. Those of you who are students here, and all the more those of you who are faculty here, you are privileged to be in one of the greatest institutions in the world, which basically tells me you are a very bright person. You're the brightest of the bright. And there are scores of people who will never reach your level of attainment or even possibility. What a privilege you have to be in a country like this, to be in an institution like this. University means to find unity in diversity. You will never find unity in diversity if you don't start from the sacred definition of what life is all about. We will have our differences. I just challenge you. Be patient, be kind, be tolerant. Those of you who disagree with us, you will never hear an ill will word from me. I don't desire to do that. I want to live and let live. But all I ask, if an academy is going to be honest, please give it the platform to proclaim dissenting views peaceably and let the truth win out in the end. If you stifle a worldview just because you don't like it, that's not a fair education. Truth will ultimately triumph. And I close with this illustration. Some of you have heard me give it. When I was in the Middle East, trying to bring reconciliation between the Jewish and the Palestinian forces, I was one of 5 others who was invited by the Archbishop of Canterbury. And we were with the worst of them in their vitriol, Yasser Arafat, and all were part of the meeting. I blocked out of the Yasser Arafat meeting because I really felt he'd have all the cameras flashing there. He was going to use it for publicity, and my guess was right. That was the only one with which I told the Archbishop, I don't feel comfortable. I think this is going to be used rather than legitimately given a platform. But I met with everybody else. On the last day, we were in Ramallah with Sheikh Talal, solidly built guy, who was one of the 4 founders of Hamas. His wife put on a great lunch, invited many of Arafat's right-hand men and men who'd been in prison for all kinds of acts. He himself, I think, had served 18 years. Great meal. The room is now full of cigarette smoke. And I'm struggling with my voice because I'm really allergic to that, with 2 vocal ulcers. But we are going through the whole thing. And at the end, the Archbishop says, I'd like each one of you men to ask him one question. Just one. I won't tell you what I asked because the meeting was private, but I didn't like his answer. And when I finished listening to his answer, I said, Sheikh, you and I will probably never see each other again. I was sitting pretty close to him. I said, I want to just say one thing to you and leave that with you. I said, 5,000 years ago, a man you and I respect by the name of Abraham took his son up a mountain to offer his son in sacrifice. Remember that story? He said, yes. I said, please, let's not debate which son it was. Let's just agree it was his son. He said, yes. I said, he takes his son up and as a test of his faith is going to offer his son to somehow gain God's approval there. And as the axe is about to come down, God stops his arm, keeps him from going through. Remember that story? He said, yes. I said, what did God say? I said, God said, stop. I myself will provide. He said, that's right. I said, here in Ramallah, we are very close to a hill. 2,000 years ago, God kept that promise and took his own son up that hill. Sheikh, at that time, the axe did not stop. Son of God, spade for you and for me. And what I want to leave with you is this, Sheikh. Until you and I receive the Son that God has provided for us, we'll be offering our own sons and daughters on the battlefields of this world for power, for land, for position, and for prestige. Till you and I receive that Son, that's what we'll be doing, offering our own sons. And he'd offered some of his sons. There's a pin drop silence in the room. And the Archbishop says, I guess it's time for us to go. I figured I'd blown it. So we're walking away, and the Archbishop comes and puts his arm around me, and he says, thank you, Ravi, that was of God. I said, boy, I sure hope so. And we're going down the steps, and the Archbishop is the guest of honor. The Sheikh is ushering him. Little did I know he was hastening the procedure to come running over to me. He comes running over just as I'm about to get into the car. He twirls me around. Big guy. I've got 2 metal rods in my back. I figured, Ramallah, a grave waits for me now. He twirled me around, he looked at me, and he patted me on both sides of the face. And he kissed me. And he said, Mr. Zacharias, you're a good man. I hope you and I see each other again someday. And he gave me a big bear hug, and we bid each other goodbye. 2 different worldviews, 2 different political agendas, same answer for both. The Christ in the heart that would give you peace and take away the sword, take away the hate. It spoke to him, and his eyes were moist with tears, and I could just see how deeply he was reflecting on it. Tolerance, we will hopefully live to see day after day after day, where in our disagreement we can still embrace one another and say, as a fellow human being, I respect your right to live peaceably within yourself, but there is a God in the end who will judge each one of us, and I live my life with that sacred trust that my life is a gift from him, and for that I want to honor him in body, mind, and soul. That's my prayer. Dartmouth, all the best to you. May your greatest days be ahead. Thank you for hosting us.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.